and welcome to ECCB Connects. In this program, we'll bring you part one of the 21st Sir Arthur Lewis Memorial Lecture delivered by Professor Avinash Persaud. Professor Persaud spoke on the topic, the gig economy, secular stagnation, and Sir Arthur Lewis.
At the age of just 33, Sir Arthur Lewis became the first black man to hold a professorial chair in a British university. He went on to become the first development economist to win the Nobel. He was the first black man to win the prize in the sciences. He was the first West Indian. Nothing more needs to be said to explain the honor and pride I have in giving a lecture in his name, and doing so in one of the great institutions of Caribbean integration, a subject dear to his heart. But I will say more. My intention tonight, ladies and gentlemen, is to show how the ideas of this great West Indian help us to understand the 21st century, help us to understand global development and the new gig economy, and how his ideas can help us to improve the lot of humanity, his central passion. We are living, ladies and gentlemen, in the age of Trumpism. Borders are returning. Brexit beckons. Nationalists triumph at the polls and rattle their sabers. Next year, in the land of liberté, égalité, and fraternité, Marine Le Pen's National Front will win the first round of the French presidential election. To dismiss Trumpism as the last gasp of misogyny and racism at the departure of America's most successful president is to miss the wider picture and to be dangerously complacent over what comes next. Our malaise is not a modern one, only to be understood in terms of millennials and social media. It was foretold in Sir Arthur Lewis's tale of growth under unlimited supplies of labor, written in Manchester in 1954, long before the internet was imagined. There is no better way to mark the brilliance of a social scientist than to use current data to illustrate a theory he had 60 years ago. Only a small fraction of economists win the Nobel. Only a small fraction of these would pass that test. It's a test that would please Sir Arthur. He was a strong believer in the scientific method, the development of which he witnessed firsthand when he was teaching alongside Sir Karl Popper in the 1940s at the London School of Economics. The data I would like to use today was recently unpacked by Banko Miljonovic of the Luxembourg Income Center. It tells the story of the most important development in global society and explains our malaise. Are you of an age, I ask, looking out to the audience here tonight, are you of an age where you can remember the death of Chairman Mao, Nadia Comaneci's 7 perfect tens at the Montreal Olympics, or the landing of Viking 1 on Mars? Now, I should point out to those whose memories do not stretch back that far, who often think their seniors are as clueless as they are uncool, that humanity did already know that there was no one on Mars to befriend when we launched Viking 1. Otherwise, we obviously wouldn't have called the first landing party the Vikings. But if you can remember the downing of Cubana Flight 455, Anguilla being granted its own constitution, the announcement of the Caribbean's first Nobel, then according to Milanovic's data, Within your lifetime, one life, just 30 years, you have been witness to the largest reordering of incomes around the world in the history of humanity. Back in 1986, an unskilled worker in the United States earned on average 6 times what a skilled worker in China received. 6 times. For most people, where you were born determined what life you would lead. Economists call this citizenship rent, the amount earned by simply being born in one place over another. Mr. Trump calls this when America was great. And you can see his point. 30 years later, that wage gap between the unskilled of America and the skilled of the developing world has not shrunk. It has disappeared. Citizenship rent is being corroded. This happened as a result of one more example of being careful of what you wish for. When the Cold War ended in 1989, with the collapse of the Berlin Wall, everyone rushed to declare themselves capitalist and open for business. The triumph of capitalism led to the return of internationally mobile capital and goods. The effect was that the owners of firms were able to operate as if there was an unlimited supply of labor. Investment and production chased lower wages around the world. What was once done by steel workers in Gary, Indiana for a premium can now be made better, faster, cheaper in Guangdong, China. What transpired was a giant reshuffling of global production and incomes. Over the past 18 months, Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders introduced us to the losers of this Detroit shuffle. Blue-collar workers from last night's battleground states experienced no increase in real incomes over 30 years. The world passed them by. Their dreams departed. But this isn't just a story of the Rust Belt in China. It has been estimated that in a few years' time, half of the entire workforce in America and in many other places will operate in the so-called gig economy, or in other words, the Uber economy, where workers are individual contractors on websites that make no commitment to future work or pay, and certainly don't offer medical benefits or training, skills or sick leave. If these are employment contracts, they are zero-hour employment contracts. Before, the firm was the economic unit, the unit of production and decision-making. Today, the economic unit is the individual, with those who assemble stuff together, or consumers being able to buy the cheapest private contractor of that service or skill locally or globally. This is good if you have rare skills, and these websites connect you to new customers, and bad if those with your common skills bid down your hourly wage. Governments of all hues told these less well-qualified, disintermediated by Asia and technology, that it was their fault for having common skills that were cheaply available elsewhere, or their fault for being too old to retrain. Both jobs and capital were exported, leaving behind secular stagnation. The state increasingly pushed these losers off welfare, reduced their medical benefits, put their kids in sinking schools. The blow was initially cushioned by cheap imports, cheap credit to buy these imports, and distracting wars. There was for a while a youthful excitement around the privilege of working from home in your pajamas for longer hours, less pay, and with no pension or health benefits. The global financial crisis of 2007 to 2009 revealed how these temporary indulgences were papering over fundamental fault lines. Trump and the Brexiteers told these losers it wasn't their fault. It was Mexico's, or China's, or trade deals. Like a bad Hollywood sequel, he told them that if only they took back what was theirs from shady-looking foreigners, America would be great again. No wonder the unswayables stuck to their man. He is unlikely to stick with them. Getting elected is not the same as governing. But whether he does or doesn't, the genuine despair and anger of his supporters will be there. As long as companies can pull new workers from Brazilian, Chinese, and Indian villages, or people in advanced economies could hire out their cars or homes or themselves by the hour on the internet, on Uber, on Airbnb, and such like, the economy could grow with profits rising but real wages flatlining. This is what Sir Arthur predicted in 1954. He further argued that the countries whose firms chased returns and production abroad would suffer from the stagnation of local investment. In these circumstances, he pointed out that there would be a case for protectionism of local industry through limits to the imports of foreign goods and the export of local capital. This is one legitimate alternative to Trumpism, heard on occasion from Bernie Sanders, Jeremy Corbyn in the UK, and sometimes even our own leaders at home. The benefits of cheap imports would be lost. Profitability and maybe investment would fall, but the decline in citizenship rent might be slowed. I doubt such efforts would bring sustainable benefit. In the case of small states who live off trade, these efforts of protectionism distract us from the only long-term surety of economic progress, which is meaningful and global competitiveness, producing stuff that others want to buy at a premium. But we must also consider something that was not foretold. The reshuffling of global production directly led to the great uplifting. In these 30 years, 1 billion people were pulled out of poverty, pulled out of the misery, inhumanity, and nastiness of poverty. 1 billion. Never before have so many lives been transformed. Most of these billion were in Asia, in China, yes, but also in many other countries, where there are a large number of workers migrating from the countryside, where there was mass education, good transport, and legal certainties. There is a third and final part of the story, according to the income data. The people who enabled this great reshuffling of production and incomes were the professional classes in the advanced economies. Lawyers, accountants, and bankers. Late at night, they say they were doing God's work, but they charged more than a few bits of silver. The commission paid to this professional class for every $1 of extra income that went to the billion of poor workers was an embarrassing 44 cents. 12% of all Americans fall into this group of professionals. They earn $150,000 a year plus. We know them. This small, self-satisfied group, multiplied by their fat wallets, have driven the market for luxury brands skywards and made blue-collar workers angrier still. To recap the parts to this story, a small elite managed a global reshuffling of production away from the advanced economies to developing countries. The elite made off like bandits. Blue-collar workers in the advanced economies stood still. 1 billion people were lifted from poverty. from a global development perspective, from a utilitarian perspective of the greatest good for the greatest number, from a moral perspective, if the way to lift 1 billion people out of poverty was to pay a few bankers a lot to get it done, and for a few 100 million people who were, in global terms, overpaid for their skills and comfortably well off, to stand still while the 1 billion caught up with them, then that would have been the right thing to do. Every time. Lifting 1 billion from poverty is priceless, is a moral imperative. The great uplifting was not to be resisted, but bettered. It is striking, therefore, that almost to a man, the liberal intelligentsia in advanced economies did try to stop the great uplifting by pushing for efforts to force China's exchange rate higher, brandishing economic models that did not predict China would grow faster for longer than any country in the history of humanity, nor models that help them to lift sustainable growth at home. Liberal economists argued that China would grow faster still if only they raised their exchange rate in a manner that had shoved the Japanese economy into a vicious deflationary cycle a decade before. The Chinese smelled a trap. They resisted the pressure for about as long as they could.
You're watching ECCB Connects, protecting our currency, developing our region.
We are from the Gordon and Walker Memorial Methodist School, and you're watching ECCB Connects.
To view any episode of ECCB Connects, anytime, any place, at your convenience, check out our YouTube channel, ECCB Connects.
We've come to the end of this week's episode of ECCB Connects, where we brought you part 1 of the 21st Sir Arthur Lewis Memorial Lecture. Next week, we'll bring you part 2 of the lecture. Thank you very much for watching, and do join us again next week.